Sorry, we've got a little barky dog in the room. Right. So, welcome to our seminar on Kikkuli, who is the oldest known horse trainer in the world. I think you're going to have to take him away. Apologies, folks. Uh, I'll explain what's happening. I've been waiting for a load of hay all day, and it's just arrived now. Wouldn't you just know it? Okay. Can you hear me okay? Because I'll just carry on regardless if that's
Yes, I can. You're fine.
Good. And the barking's not too bad. Right. Okay. Just shout if the barking intrudes too much. I'd like to welcome to our Kikkuli seminar. It gives me very, very great pleasure to introduce our two specialist speakers tonight. We have Professor Theo van den Hout, who received his PhD in Hittite and Anatolian languages from the University of Amsterdam in 1989, having previously taken a BA and MA in classics, comparative Indo-European linguistics, and Anatolian studies at both Leiden and Amsterdam. He is currently Professor of Hittite and Anatolian languages at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago and Editor-in-Chief of the Chicago Hittite Dictionary since 2000. He's the author of several books, and his most recent publication is A History of Hittite Literacy, Writing and Reading in Late Bronze Age Hittite Anatolia, and also very many articles in subjects in this field. While interested in all aspects of Late Bronze and Iron Age Anatolia, his work focuses on Hittite culture, history, and language. Besides his work on the dictionary, his recent personal interests are ancient record management, literacy and writing in Hittite society, as well as Hittite visual culture. And our second specialist presenter this evening is Peter Raulwing, who studied historical comparative linguistics, ancient Near Eastern archaeology, and excuse me. We've also got the trailer backing up now, so I'll have to apologize further. Indo-Arabian languages. His research focus and expertise focus on two areas: the cultural, social, and military history of horses and chariots in the ancient Near East and adjacent areas such as Egypt, Anatolia, Eurasia, North and Eastern Europe, focused on linguistic, archaeological, archaeozoological, historical, and other sources, including the training of chariot horses. And secondly, on the history of research in scholarship of the 19th and 20th century in ancient Near Eastern Anatolian studies, Egyptology, and historical comparative linguistics, which is a very, very interesting field in itself. He's published several articles on the Hittite horse texts and also edited Mary Litau's and Jus Kroll's selected writings in 2002 and edited studies in honor of both of them, to one of which I'm very proud to have contributed, and it was published last year. So I hope you heard that all right above the sounds of tractors and dogs barking. So welcome, gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure to have you here. I would say this evening, but of course it's the middle of the day for you. And I will be very pleased if you will take it from here. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Let me go to the slideshow. All right. I assume you can all see the screen? Nodding.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
I can.
Yes. So
can I just say one last thing? Any questions, please put into the chat or save till the end, folks, and then we'll discuss them then. Sorry, gentlemen. Please do carry on.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we just wanted to send a few words before we start. We didn't know exactly who the audience would be, so we kept it on a very high level where needed, but also go into some details also where needed. So we, as Miriam just said, if you have any questions, we are open to anything either in the roundtable afterwards. We have a bunch of good slides, hopefully, and we can always put them up later. So if you have a question or anything, we can just go after the talk. So today we talk about the Kikkuli text, and you see the first abbreviation there, CTH 284, Catalogue des Textes Hittite. We go into that a little bit later, and we provide today a brief history, a brief interdisciplinary history. And let's see how this works. There we go. And we have basically three main sections. The first is an introduction setting the stage, where we talk a little bit about the Hittites and Hittites, horses, and chariots. Then the Hittite horse texts, there are three, but then specifically about the Kikkuli text, which is the CTH 284 number. And then we go into some history of the text, what we can deduct, political interpretations, what does the Kikkuli text contain, and what are the challenges for certain terms to translate them. And I hand it over to Theo, who can just give a quick introduction about the Hittites and where they were, what they are, what they did.
Thank you, Peter. So here you recognize what we nowadays in modern terms call in the center, the Republic of Turkey, Türkiye, as we are supposed to say nowadays. That was once in the late Bronze Age, so we're talking about 1650 to about 1200 BC. The land of the Hittite Kingdom. Some people like to call it the Hittite Empire. I usually speak of the Hittite Kingdom. Here you see, no, you can leave it.
There we go. One more.
Back to, So here you see more of a little bit of a close-up of the area of, you could say, the extent of the Hittite Kingdom or its sphere of influence. So you can see how it reached almost all the way to the west coast of Anatolia, as we call it in classical terms, and to the east. It doesn't quite reach the modern eastern Turkish border, but it does reach into and cover a lot of northern Syria. Of course, these borders were elastic. They changed with Hittite history, but this is roughly the area of the Hittite Kingdom. So here you see the kings of the Hittite Kingdom from, as I said earlier, about 1650, when the kingdom was founded at the place of the Hittite capital. And we have one more slide, I guess. And it goes down all the way to the end of the 13th century BC, around 1200, when the Hittite Kingdom, vanished. The current thinking that I think all Hittitologists adhere to is that the elite of the Hittite Kingdom, the kings and their retainers, simply abandoned the capital as it was and went somewhere else. The only problem is that we don't know where they went, and certainly there was no follow-up. Somehow with the elite leaving the capital, that was the end of the Hittite Kingdom as we know it. The Hittite Kingdom was let's say a country, a land with many languages. Those of you who have traveled in Turkey know it is very mountainous. There are also plains, but it is very mountainous, and that means that there were a lot of pockets, you could say, geographically determined, where a lot of individual languages persisted. You see here in the graph over the two first millenniums the languages, so Hittite, Palaic, Cuneiform Luwian, Hieroglyphic Luwian, those were spoken and written during the second millennium BC, during the time of the Hittite Kingdom. If you look below, you will see on the far left a classic Hittite tablet. They wrote on clay tablets, and they wrote in the cuneiform script that they had adopted and adapted from Mesopotamia. However, and that in itself is very interesting, they developed for, you could say, internal purposes, also their own, what we call hieroglyphic script. You see a picture or an example of that right in the middle. It looks a little bit, you could say, at first sight, like the Egyptian hieroglyphic script, which is the reason why we name it in that way. But the two scripts have nothing in common, have nothing to do with each other. It is a purely indigenous Anatolian creation. You could say that the cuneiform, which you see on the far left, was used for internal administrative purposes. The entire administration of the Hittite kingdom was conducted in the Hittite language in cuneiform. But as soon as they wanted to address the population at large and had publicly displayed inscriptions, they used the, within quotes, the hieroglyphic script that you see in the middle. The interesting thing there is that actually, whereas the cuneiform writes Hittite, the hieroglyphs write a closely related language, but not Hittite, the closely related language that we call Luwian. They are, you could say, the relation between the two is like Spanish versus Italian. So they are closely related, but they are different languages. And I haven't mentioned that yet. As many of you may also know, Hittite Hittite is the oldest known Indo-European language, which means that Hittite was related to Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, other Indo-Iranian languages, but also ultimately to English, many of the modern language. So they are all together in the Indo-European language family, and Hittite is the oldest known representative of that family. This language group, the subgroup to which Hittite and Luwian belonged, we call the Anatolian languages, and they continued after the fall, collapse, vanishing, whatever you want to call it, of the Hittite kingdom. They continued into the first millennium, when it fragmented, balkanized into a number of smaller kingdoms. The kingdoms of the Lydians, you all have heard of King Croesus, for example, the Lycians, the Carians, and there are two more. And an example of that, of the scripts that they used, you see there on the far right hand, which is an example of Carian. For Carian, think of Mausolos, for example, in Halicarnassus. So those are the scripts and the languages that we know. Yeah, I think we should go on to the next.
And just one addition.
Yeah.
This is a Greek script that relates.
The script is, thank you. The script is alphabetic. It looks like Greek, but it isn't. Thank you.
All right.
So, of course, the Kikkuli text that we are talking about today was written on cuneiform tablets in the Hittite language. We have over 30,000 tablets, or mostly fragments of tablets, that have come down to us, and each excavation adds more of them, so we certainly haven't seen the end of them. They wrote almost exclusively on clay. However, for very special occasions like state treaties, they would write the cuneiform on metal tablets. We have mentionings of gold, silver, bronze, and iron tablets. They have all been lost. They've all been, certainly the gold and silver ones have been melted down over time. But there's one exception, and that you see here is a pristinely preserved bronze tablet. It was once hung in probably a temple, and the chains by which it was hung are still there, also preserved. So this is a really, actually for the entire ancient Middle East, a unique find, a unique document from the 13th century BC. This is what most of the Hittite clay tablets look like. So these are the normal ones. This is I would say, a classic example. It's about your 8 by 11 inches. It is written in 2 columns on either side. You can see with the 2 vertical lines down the middle, the column divider, so where the 2 columns are separated from each other. And the script simply runs from left to right per column. And then on the left side, it ends, and then you see a blank space where the text has ended. And they still come out of the ground every year, as I said, and here you see an example of a Hittite cuneiform tablet being excavated.
All right.
This is more for people.
Now to the horse part. Hittites, horses, and chariots. This is a map from Cornelia Becker, as you see at the bottom in the bibliographical hint there. She is listing finds, locations with horse remains, and I just extracted the ones in modern Turkey in the Hittite Empire. You see those, and I'm not sure if the numbers are too small, but you kind of find out where Troy is on the top left in Boğazköy 11, and then there are a couple of others in the vicinity, Yarikaya, Osman Kayası, and so on. And the reason I am mentioning this is there are horse remains in the Hittite Empire. It's from in the late Bronze Age and also Iron Age. And if we look at latest DNA research, this is an article by Silvia Goimares. They analyzed these skeleton remains, and they came to the conclusion, which is highlighted on the left, that the horse was not domesticated in Anatolia, which we kind of knew, but now it's confirmed. And that also means that horses we have there have been bred. There were horses coming in from other areas, mostly from probably north of the Caucasus. Very interesting article, so I recommend to take a closer look. And on the side of the written evidence, so the Hittites used exclusively a sumerogram for horse, which you see in the top line on the left. It says Anshi Kura. Anshi is a generic term for equid. Kuram, it's basically if you translate it as donkey or something, it's donkey from the mountain lands of sometimes foreign lands. The eku on the left side should have an asterisk because it is actually not part of any of the 30,000 texts. It is reconstructed, and the Hittites simply used this sumerogram when they wrote the word for horse, which we will see later on. On the right side, you see, and we're not reading anything on the right side, is the article that Theo wrote in the Lexicon für Archäologie on horses in Anatolia. So this is another. We will make the slide available as a PDF sometime end of the day or tomorrow. I have to add the bibliography, so you don't have to. You have your slide and you can look up the bibliography that we are mentioning throughout this presentation. For vehicles, Theo also wrote the article in the lexicon on wagon, which is Wagen in German, which also includes chariots. And there are a couple of terms that we have, but maybe you want to.
Yeah, you see them here on the screen. So the Hittite word, which is in lowercase italics, Hulugani. The gish that precedes it comes from Sumerian, and simply means that it was mostly made out of wood. It figures in the texts as a vehicle on which the king could ride, and the queen also. Below that you see gish, so again it indicates that the following word designates or denotes an object mostly made out of wood. That is gish gigir. It is written in capitals, and that means that it is a Sumerian, originally pictogram. You have to remember, I said in the beginning that the Hittites borrowed, adopted, and adapted the cuneiform script from Mesopotamia, and it had its origin there in Sumerian. That those were the people, you could say, who invented the cuneiform script. And so when the Hittites adopted and adapted the cuneiform script, they also adapted the use of Sumerian pictograms, and for which we very often don't know what the Hittite reading behind it was. It is like our numbers. We write the number 2 with the Arabic number 2, and when you, an English speaker, see it, you will say 2. Peter, being a German, he will say zwei. I, being Dutch, I will say twee. So it can be read in any language. It is really a character in the Chinese sense of the word. So in case if the Hittites only write a Sumerogram, then we don't know what Hittite reading was behind it. Anyway, and then you see at the very bottom another Sumerogram recognizable by the capitals. And again, it has the determinative gish. That is more of a four-wheeled, two-axle vehicle for to transport freight or whatever.
Yeah, and the accent on the gid is not an accent. It's just it's the sign for gid, and the second most frequent sign. So the Hittitologists, archaeologists actually came up with putting an accent like this on it, which is then the second most frequented. It would be, and to the left side, it would be the third most frequent. And then you see some numbers every now and then. You might see them later on. We wanted to show you some. There isn't much in terms of pictographical reference. You see the top left, and in the middle you see the Hittite chariots depicted at the Battle of Kadesh. From the Egyptian viewpoint, you see an old Hittite helmet preserved, and a sword from a Hittite sword, which is in the museum, in the War Museum in Bochum. We did not usually fall back on reconstructions, but this is the only exception we have. This is a reconstruction. The Battle of Kadesh shows you the rendering of Hittite chariots. Usually a chariot had 2 occupants, and you see that in the background for the Egyptian chariots. And they invented something unique, or they adopted it. We can talk about it later on, and we have Steve as an expert there. They have a third man. You see the third man there on the right side, and the vehicle on the bottom right with the spear. You have the charioteer with the shield, and charioteer with the shield, and a chariot driver with who is holding the reins. Just to give you an impression what these chariots looked like and how we imagine them. And I'm not getting into the construction at this point. Now we're coming to the second chapter, the horse tax. And if you go, not now, hopefully, go to the link below, the Hittite portal in Würzburg, you can see under concordance, you will see the link ending with CTH. There are all the CTH numbers listed. Emmanuel Laroche, who is listed there on the left side, he published, he categorized these texts according to the genre of historical texts, and one of them was also the Hittite horse text, and he gave him the numbers 284 to 286, and 284 stands for the Kikkuli text, 285 for the second training instruction, and 286 for the third one. There is also, when you go there, you will see 287, and these are fragments. So we leave those fragments of hippological texts out for today. And if you go to this page, this is what you find, not necessarily a page turner here, but what they did in Mainz, and this is the archive, you will see pictures. You can click on the camera, and I'll show you this in the next picture. You see that the Kikkuli text, this CTH 284, consists of these inventory numbers. You see 5M, Boaskö. These are all inventory numbers of the tablets, and then you see also VAT, which is Vordersache Texte in the museum in Berlin. So these fragments basically make up what we call the Kikkuli text. It's the same for the second training instruction 285, and then even more fragments for 286. Just to give you an idea where you could look these fragments up and how the fragments are actually being put together. Taking just CTH 284, Kikkuli text, and if you click on these cameras, this is what you find. Not very, if you see a little fragment there, it's probably the size of a cookie. It's not very exciting, but when we do have a nicer tablet, larger tablets, some of them are in Berlin, and we talk about them a little later. You see the top right, VAT 6693. This is a larger text, and then Bo 1047 as well. This is just, and I don't bother you with the German part, but if you look at the CTH numbers and the text, these are the tablets and the KUB publications, KBO these are the publications where you find those published, and those make practically the Kikkuli text. So when you read a translation, what you see here is practically happening under the hood, and you don't have to worry about it. You would then read the translation. And Theo wrote an article about 20 years ago, Another View of Hittite Literature, in which he categorized the text into two buckets, if you want, a text with duplicates and unica. And maybe, Theo, you can.
Yeah, what is interesting here is that, so if you take an aerial view, so to speak, of all the Hittite texts together, you see that some texts were from the beginning, from 1650 onwards, continuously copied, sometimes updated. So that's until the end of the kingdom around 1200. So that speaks for a continued interest in those texts throughout the history of the Hittite kingdom. And those are the texts with duplicates that you see under A in the left column. And you see the several genres there, and most of the genre names, I think, speak for themselves. On the right side, under Unica, you find those texts of which we usually, or not usually, of which we don't have copies, don't have duplicates, as we call them, or textual witnesses, they say in the biblical fields. For example, letters, they came in, they were read, and then they were kept for a while, but then when they were no longer of any value to the current administration, they were discarded. You can drop a clay tablet in a bucket of water and use the clay again for another text. And so most of the texts in the right column are of a very practical administrative value that after a while was no longer of any relevance to the administration. But the interesting thing here is, and I think that is very important, is that our hippological texts, so the CTH 284, the Kikkuli text and the others, actually they existed only in a single copy. Now, of course, it's debatable. To me, that sounds as if they were not used every day. They were apparently considered, important enough to have one copy of them simply on file, on the shelf, in the capital, but they were not copied and copied time and again. So yeah, I mean that is up for debate. yeah, whatever you want to say about it. Okay, yeah, I think we can go to the next
Sorry.
slide.
Yeah.
As far as the dating goes, I think there is, most anthropologists will say that the Kikkuli text as we have it, the copy itself, the physical tablet, goes back to and you find it at the very bottom, training instruction 1, CGH 284, dates to the 13th century, but I would say the early 13th century personally, but it very likely goes back to an older original, which we don't have anymore, which may have been written down in the 15th century BC. And the other two texts, 286 and 285, they are almost as old, or yeah, a little bit younger than those. Yeah, so that's I think what the Communis Opinio now says about the dating of the texts.
Yeah, and Annelies Kammenhuber, who edited all three texts, all Hittite training instructions for the first time in 1961, you'll see that later. She actually came up with the opposite dating. For her, the training instruction was an original. She basically put everything upside down, and then Erich Neu, who wrote this article in 1986, used different paleographic criteria to come to this result. This is more an internal Hittitological problem,
Yeah,
and we all end up in the 15th century anyways with the Kikkuli
right.
text.
It's the reason why we think there was a lost original, which was the earliest one. It's an interplay between, on the one hand, the cuneiform script, which we can at least roughly date. So as I said, the physical copy of 284, the Kikkuli text, was written quite late. But if you look at the language, that's another thing. The language there displays several grammatical phenomena that clearly point to an older version, for which we then say, well, somewhere in the 15th century, 1400 something.
All right. Now, finally, after a long time, we get to the Kikkuli text. I was able to pull up two color copies. The copies that I published in an article that were given to me by the Vorderasiatisches Museum were actually turning out black and white, and they were published upside down. You will see that later. So these are the one is from a catalog, and the other one is from a book on Arabic horses. And you see here tablet 4, the obverse and the reverse, and then the inventory number for the Berlin Museum is VAT 6693. And at the colophon, which is like the end of the tablet, in this case, it's not only, they didn't only write on the front and back, but also on the edge because it was fairly thick. You see here that the 4th tablet is unfinished. That's what the scribe left there. So which is an interesting piece of information. And here we want to show you the first 2 lines of the Kikkuli text, the original, then the autograph, and then the transliteration, cuneiform sign by cuneiform sign, and then the translation, and then a few words. And do you want to say anything on the?
Yeah, so what you see, the photo shows you the very top of the tablet with the first 2 lines, and then you can see it on the right side of the photo. You see the remains of what we call a paragraph line. The Hittite scribes divided their texts into, let's say, meaningful chunks, paragraphs. And so this is the opening of the text. Thus speaks Kikkuli, the horse trainer, and he gives his indication where he comes from. He was from the land of Mitanni, and Mitanni is the northern Mesopotamian area. So technically, he did not come from Anatolia. He was not, so to speak, a Hittite citizen, and we will probably never know. Did he ever set foot in Anatolia? Did he ever come to the Hittite capital, but I think we will talk about transmissions of the text at some later point.
Yeah, and then his name, there are some etymologies what his name could mean, but I didn't list them because they are not convincing. Sometimes names are very hard to translate. In this case is one of them. Interesting is his profession title. What I render it as horse trainer, some others may use horse master or something else. And you see that it is a pretty long word. And if you break it up and you see that in the right column, there's the word ashu, which is actually the word, the Old Indic. It's a rendering of the Old Indic word for horse, ashwa. There is a middle part, which looks a little strange with the double S with the hacheks, but that's how the Hittites had to render the name, having only the cuneiform script available, which was based on usually a consonant. And you see that over there, the vowels, and then you have a vowel and a consonant and a vowel. So that's the rendering of his name, Ashtoshani, and Ni also has a certain meaning. It's a suffix. We get to that later, but what is very remarkable here is that he introduces himself, gives his profession, horse trainer in the widest sense, and where he's from. And that's, of course, this introduction formula, you find it elsewhere in rituals and so on, but we have it's remarkable that we actually have this from Kikkuli, and that's why then the Kikkuli text is named after Kikkuli. We don't read through the German on the right side. This is from Kammenhuber's edition. You see these the transliteration on the left side, the two lines we just saw, and then thus speaks Kikkuli from the land of Mitanni, and then he lets the horses on the pasture. We go into that a little later, and then they do certain exercises, and she translated certain verbs as galloping. You see line 5, galopir, and then you see other terms about feeding, and then you see miles and fields. And so basically it describes in these 23 lines that the horses are doing something. They have to exercise something. They get fed, they get water, they get hay. You see that in line 9 on the right side, eine Hand Heu, one handful of hay. They are harnessed, they go in the stable, line 19. The groom puts them in the stable, they eat something, and then the last line, 23, is he puts a muzzle on. We don't play it now, but there is Peter Josny who actually played an important role in classifying the Hittite language as Indo-European. You see him on the right side actually working on a cuneiform Luwian inscription. There is a radio transmission from 1932 where he talks about the Kikkuli text in Czech. I'll add the English translation of that, and if we have time later, we can play it. If not, do it at home. It's very interesting. It's the first to hear his voice, and second, over 90 years ago, he talks about the Kikkuli text, and we'll see later in what publication he used to publish his results. So the early interdisciplinary interest in the Kikkuli text was not necessarily because people read the text. It's so dramatic, literally wise. It's kind of a repetitive instructions what to do with the horses, but the interest was focused on so-called Indo-Aryan terms in the Kikkuli text. And Indo-Aryan means here, in this case, it is an older dialect than Vedic English, than Old Indic. So now the interesting question is, how do these terms end up in the Kikkuli text? We get to that a little later, but these are terms on the right side, Peter Jensen listed there. And you see the Aika Vatana. Vatana, it means round, something like round. And Aika Eka, it means one. And we have names for rounds in only the odd numbers. Aika, Tera, Panza, Shatta, and Nava. So it's 1, 3, 5, and 9. We get to that a little later. He was the first, Jensen was the first one. He taught in Marburg at the time, archaeologist. He was the first who said, oh, these names that you see here, Aika Vatana, that is definitely related to Old Indic. So that was one of the early interests that beyond the hippological purpose of the Kikkuli text. And then Ernst Herzfeld, who is known for his Persepolis excavation, specifically interesting here for the ISAC in Chicago, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. And Herzfeld wrote in Archäologische Mitteilung aus Iran, and see that in the third line from the bottom, he says that Kikkuli's title certainly contains the word ashwa, which is Old Indic for horse. So he was, from what I could find, the first to actually connect it the Kikkuli's profession title to the word for horse. And here are again these numbers. On the left side, you see sign by the transliteration, sign by sign, Aikawatana, and then in brackets, it's the transcription, how it would actually look like. And then on the right side, you see the the Vedic equivalent. So number 3 is tree, 5 is pancha, sapta is 7, nava is 9. Now, for nava, you can see that the Hittite scribes actually shortened it a little bit. The original would be Navavatana, but they wrote Navatana. And you see also the Vashana, which is a kind of track. It is described twice. I think we have it later on. It is surrounded, it has wooden poles, so the horses have to go around it, and it's a kind of training ground. And if we go back to the last line there, Kikkuli's profession title, the suggestion that Rüdiger Schmidt and myself have made based on an existing suggestion is that his profession title contains the word Ashvar, then something like a rendering of the Vedic root, sorry for the Vedish there, should be Vedic, Shami, which means to calm down, to bring to rest, and the translation of his profession title would be something like he who calms down the whole, or who brings them to exhaustion and then calms them down, something like that in this direction. That is the most plausible that we have based on the linguistic evidence. Very quickly on the languages used in the text here, if you want.
Yeah, so the basic text is in the Hittite language, this oldest known Indo-European language, as I mentioned before, and because of the fact that the cuneiform script was imported from Mesopotamia, originally from Sumer, and then through the Semitic-speaking Assyrians, Babylonians, that we also call Akkadians as more of an umbrella term. So you see in the text also Sumerian words and Akkadian words, but there are also Hurrian words. The thing is that the kingdom of Mitanni, where Kikkuli himself says that he came from, it is usually thought that the Mitanni kingdom was contained a people who spoke their own Hurrian language, which is neither Indo-European nor Semitic, but is its own little group together with Urartian, as you see there. But that this Hurrian population was ruled by an Indo-Aryan elite. Several of the Mitannian kings bear names, royal names, that are also very clearly Indo-Iranian in character. And we also have, as Peter just mentioned, these Wartana terms in the Kikkuli text. So there is enough linguistic evidence to indeed, to explain why suddenly these Indo-Iranian terms turn up in this text that originally must have been composed by Kikkuli, who came from Mitanni and was maybe linked to the Indo-Iranian elite that led the country.
Yeah, and to add to that, this is not a proof of a connection between, let's say, Central Anatolia and India. These are actually Indo-Aryan speaking tribes who went to India, and then those who ended up in the Near East kind of split off at one point, and then they joined the Hurrians, what then became the Hurrian Empire with the Mitanni superstratum that Theo just described. And then, so if we mentioned the collaboration, so we have 4 tablets, and only Kikkuli's name only appears on the first tablet. So strictly speaking, we cannot know if the other 4 tablets were also composed by Kikkuli, but it's a continuous work. So we call these 4 tablets now the Kikkuli text. So this is definitely allowed and legitimate for all 4 tablets. And sorry, going back, you see that's that's Borskoi, and there is a certain place where they were found. I should have marked it. Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe add one thing. So I think all 4 tablets of the Kikkuli text, but also the tablets that belong to CTH 285 and 286 were found in, and that you see sort of on the map in the middle. On the east side, you see Büyükale, which is Turkish for great fortress, great castle. That was the Acropolis, where probably the elite lived. And there were more places where tablets were kept in the Hittite capital. But it is pretty clear, if you look at all the texts that were found on the Acropolis, that those were texts that were, let's say, not used on a daily basis. So that kind of confirms, although that's a big word, confirms that indeed the Kikkuli text, being preserved only in single copies, was not a composition, was not a text that, let's say, was of a daily importance to the Hittite elite.
All right, here you see a reconstruction of the Büyükale. We can then also assume with a high degree of certainty that Kikkuli worked with his grooms and translators who helped the Hittite scribe to record his training program. We don't know if Kikkuli himself had any cuneiform tablets. We could assume that he, as many house trainers do, that this was orally, transferred from one house trainer to the other. And what Kammenhuber observed, and what we can confirm, is that each of these tablets, of these 4 tablets of the Kikkuli text, has its own Hittite scribe. And she describes for tablet 1, it's a very precise writer with a good knowledge of Hittite. The second tablet was a writer who tried to put in more variations of the language, but also made some mistakes, because he didn't read Theo's grammar. So that, and the third one, the writer of the third tablet was more careful. A careful writer tried to make less mistakes, but had less knowledge of Hittite language. And the 4th tablet was a scribe who described this, what the Vashana, the training ground, very well, but with greater clearness. But otherwise, he was not very careful. That's a very interesting fact, philological fact that Kammenhuber pointed out in her edition. And she also said that, and we will look at that currently in more detail if this is actually true, if we come to more results there, if several people actually worked on one tablet, not just one scribe. On the right side, you see where the tablet, it's a reconstruction of the place where the Kikkuli text was found. It's the house of...
no, the House am Hang is outside of the Acropolis. So actually on the far right, you see on top of the slope, that's where the text was found.
In the magazine, what we saw in the magazines here on this side, in the magazines on the right there, right?
Yeah,
and where the Büyükale is, that's right.
Yeah.
All right. We go now into some text editions. So history of the text edition, comments, typological comments, and so on. The first one you already saw when we copied out the first 2 lines. You see that in the photograph. You saw the first 2 lines. That's a picture that was taken early on. It was taken in Berlin of the cuneiform tablet, and you see that the light has been positioned in a way by the photographer to make all cuneiform signs visible without actually having to see the original tablet. Of course, it's always good to see the original tablet, but you could work with the photo on the left side to actually take a look at the orthography that was done by Figula published in 1921. Where he basically transfers every cuneiform sign onto a page, and that's an orthography. This has been published in 1921, and you see up there, this is the VAT 13060. and you can see where the text is not preserved. He marked that very clearly. So this is the way this was the first step to publish the text. The second was Emil Forrer, who was a Swiss archaeologist coming from Strasbourg to Berlin, getting his PhD in 1930 in archaeology. And since he was a Swiss citizen, he didn't fight in World War I, or he wasn't asked to. So they asked him in Berlin if he would be able or willing to look at these Hittite texts that they shipped after the excavation before World War I, and they had thousands of texts. So Forrer was able to go through all these texts during World War I, and he published an article in 1922, as you can see here. And if you go to the bottom right of that page that we copied there, see again VAT 13060. So that is actually the earliest publication of the Kikkuli text, and you see the first two lines, different signs there. We made some progress since 1922, but you can see, "Thus speaks Kikkuli," and then he didn't recognize his professional title there, but from the land of Mitanni. So that's the first publication by Forrer. The mentioned Rosny published the first translation of the Kikkuli text into French in 1931 in his own journal. He was in Prague at the time, Archiv Orientalny. We then have a German author, Potratz, who was actually familiar with horses, a rider himself, studied in Leipzig, and got his PhD on the translation of the horse text. Pferdetext is horse text from the archive in Borskoi. It's his transcription, translation, and comment. It was published in two versions. One, his original thesis, which you see on the right, and then another version was published as Pferd in der Frühzeit, the horse in early times. And both editions have been lost. There are only very few copies available. He translated for the first time the Kikkuli text, the complete text, into German. Now, Annelies Kammerhuber, who was a Hittitologist in Munich most of her time, she started publishing the all Hittite texts, CTH 84 to 86, already in 1952, then in a revised edition, but the work that is quoted most is her Hippologia Hittitica, you see on the right, and we already saw a page from her transliteration and the translation from there. That is the editio princeps of all three Hittite horse training texts. We jump a couple of years further. A German, Gerhard Probst, who lived in the US, I guess, did a kind of bibliophile book where he translated the Kikkuli text based on Potratz, 1938, which you saw a minute ago, in a limited edition. And this is like a flyer, so it's not really a book. You can take it out, and it's all in capitals. It's a collector's item. I haven't seen an original, but I saw a copy of it. But instead of translating from Kammerhuber, he actually translated from Potratz. So it's a little outdated, but it's, it has to be mentioned. Let me go one. What happened here? There we go. The King Library asked me a couple of years ago, Joachim Marzahn, who was the curator of the cuneiform tablets in Berlin, to write a preface for a second edition. And you see they came up with a bibliophile book. It's Japanese handmade paper, and you see there the two lines of the Kikkuli text printed into the cover here. Otherwise, the text that Probst did is unchanged, but there's also a limited edition for this book. Jumping a couple of years further, a very interesting book came from Anne Nyland in 1993, her dissertation. She put the Kikkuli text in practice. Therefore, she had to make certain assumptions. And you see the horses were basically tethered to a car, and she made a decision which distances they had to go and which gates they had to use. And we talk a little bit later about it, and we can talk more in the roundtable. The online edition, which is the second one, the Kikkuli method of horse fitness, is the one that is mostly available. The first edition from 1993 is not easy to get. I think Steve has a copy and talk
Yes.
about it. The Another book that came out not on the Kikkuli text itself, but on the horse in the ancient Near East, as the title says there. He was definitely looking at Kammenhuber's Kikkuli text. Valentin Horn was also a person familiar with horses. The book was published after he passed away by his wife, and we'll see later on when he talked to some talk about training interpretations that he visualized Kammenhuber's information she put in the book into tables, so we can clearly see the purpose of the text as an interval training. Another book that came out in '95 is that of Frank Starke in a prestigious series, Studien zu den Boerscher-Texten, where he suggested a different hippological interpretation without translating the Kikkuli text. So for him, we see it later, it has more to do with what dressage horses are doing, like turning in a circle. However, that is definitely wrong, as we find, and we go to that a little later. '98, first translation into French of the Kikkuli text by Emilia Masson. She also follows Starke's interpretation. Don't have to get into more details. And then, I'm sorry, I have to quote myself. That's an article that I wrote with Rüdiger Schmidt about the etymology of Ashashani. It's a little more detailed. You see the page number. It's a fairly long article. And those, if somebody would like to have it, I have a PDF of it. These are from the days where there were no PDFs. And I'm happy to share this. I wrote two other articles, one in '99. It's more like an overview of interpretations that we have in the Festspiel Wolfgang Meid. And then the other one in the proceedings of a symposium, Les Écrits dans le monde méditerranéen, Antique, and that is another over. This in English, the other ones were in German. I can also send out a PDF of this one. The last one of myself is the one I wrote with Herbert Meyer, a horse trainer expert in the history of horses, on the Kikkuli text and specifically on interpretation. You see there, we didn't see the final proof, and the Kikkuli text is upside down. Most people will not notice it, but unfortunately, it happened. So we are one section in this article is specifically to contradict Starke's interpretation. A couple of years later, Koichi Takahashi summarized Starke's research and also came to the conclusion that Starke's interpretation is correct. So you see kind of both sides, but this is not the communist opinion, but we listed it anyways here. The last one in this series of text editions is Ahmed Ünal, who was professor in Munich following Annelies Kammenhuber on her chair. He wrote the first Turkish translation into of the Kikkuli text based on a previous article that he wrote, and you can see it here. I have also PDFs of those. We can neglect this at this stage here because most of us don't read Turkish, as I assume, and the Kammenhuber edition is still the better edition. Now, we mentioned the training, the days of training, and so what the text basically does is we have training days. They are not numbered. We have to deduct it from the text by the information on what time of the day it is and what Kikkuli gives. Let them rest for 5 days and so on. And this is why, so that depending on how you count, you see that at the bottom of the training days, Potratz thinks that the first tablet contains the training content of 72 days, and Kammenhuber actually added 2 more, and that's why at the end of tablet 4, Potratz had 169, and Kammenhuber had 184. So this is the interpretation of where we segment a unit and where something new begins. I don't know, Theo, do you want to say something about these time things? But yeah, we can skip it for now and come back to it later. Here is practically again line 1 and 2. Horses are put in the stables, they are fed, they are kind of tethered at nightfall. Sorry for the typo there. The horses get out of the stable, there's an interval training happening, some horse care is happening, they get water, they get back into the stable, we get the muzzle on, another part of the night they get out again, and so on. So that's basically what these horses do, including the different training units, which we look at in a minute. Now, until 1939, based on the interpretation of the sources in the Rig Veda and others, most researchers actually thought Kikkuli composed the training for chariot horses, for racing horses, for racehorses, but that is not true. And the reason is that, among other, is that for Norbert Oettinger already pointed out that horse racing, although there are attestations for horse racing, the Hittite elite and nobility that Theo mentioned did not really invoke or use names related to horses or chariot like the Mitannian rulers did. So there's already one reason why this is not for the Kikkuli text, not for racehorses. But sorry, more important is that they actually train at night, and that there are specific rationing and fodder and withholding of it. So this really is training for chariot horses. And Sommer, Ferdinand Sommer, was a renowned Indo-Europeanist in Munich, who was one of the founding fathers of Hittitology in Germany in the early 1920s and onwards. He wrote in his review of Portraits that you see there, Orientalistische Literaturzeitung, that it's definitely a training for chariot horses. So this was established. And quickly going, we don't read all of this, but it's important. Starke basically reconstructed that Kikkuli composed the training to perform something like you see on the right side, that you see more by the dressage horses. And you see, I mentioned the 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 rounds, and the 9 rounds is supposedly what you see on the bottom right. We don't have to go into many details, but the main takeaway here is that he has to shorten the kind of established distance for one dana to 0.9 kilometers in order to make it fit for his circle. So that's already methodologically a problem that we need to address, and we have addressed it. And the other thing is that he applies modern riding principles to ancient Near Eastern chariotry. Here are a bunch of arguments. You can see that later in more detail when you get the slides. And we now get to the interval training, the visualization of it. And the first one was actually Vera Kovalevskaya in the book you see on the right. So it's a little paperback about horses and riders. And what she did in 1977 is she, and pardon my Russian translation with the help of Google, and I'm happy if somebody has a suggestion how to improve my translation there, but she kind of put these training units in the Kikkuli text into this graph. And that's the first one we know about the visualization of these training units, which makes things a little easier to understand. And then the second one is the mentioned Valentin Horn. You can see the visualization of different types of motion, verbs of motion used in the Kikkuli text, very specific ones. The type 5 you see there has been defined by Kammenhuber. It's a certain verb with a certain in a certain sequence of other words. And you see here type 5 is the darker one, and then the other types are the ones, the smaller ones to the right of it. And you see how the distance and the intensity of these training units go up from day 1 to day 120. Now, he was still under the impression that the distances were much, much longer, but Theo and others have established that the dana is about 1.5 kilometers. So the exercises, the horses in practice in Hattusha didn't have to run 10 kilometers gallop. So that would be impossible. It wouldn't make sense. In fact, Kikkuli took very good care of his horses. Let me go back one more slide on Horn. He basically came to the conclusion that there is a pre-training, there is a conditioning training. On the left side, you see a great interval, form training, and a final training. So those are the numbers we can work with, even if the actual kilometers in this case are too high. But it gives us an idea how to approach this text from another angle to come to the conclusion that Kikkuli composed interval training. And this is also what Nyland did. I show you here just how the horses are tethered to the car. You see it on the right side. That's what they did to actually perform the training. And you see here in the table of content all the different entries that modern horse trainers would use, and many of them apply to Kikkuli, and we can talk about it more in the roundtable. The next slides are about the hippological information that is provided. So we have a training program of at least 184 days. There could be also more. We have to look up, we mentioned 214 days. At one point, somebody might have interpreted the information regarding the time in a more generous way, adding a couple of more days. As I said, point 3 on the left side is definitely an interval training or conditioning training for horses to build stamina. It does include, as we have seen, instructions for taking care of the horses, feeding, water rations, management, horse management, and so on. And as I mentioned, that Sommer already pointed out in 1939, they're also withholding food and water intentionally, horses spending time at the table. Their muzzles were fitted, and the training units are performed at different times of the day. So what it does not contain is if the Kikkuli text, if the Hittites actually bought or bred horses for use of chariot warfare. They probably did, employed a combination of both. So we don't know anything how they chose the horses. And they needed, given the numbers of chariot horses used at the Battle of Kadesh, we're talking about thousands of horses. Overall, each unit had about 500 chariots, which we end up with 2,000, 3,000 chariots for the Hittites. We don't know anything about the selection process. Theo mentioned already, we don't know if Kikkuli actually was in Hattusha. It would have made the most sense, but we don't know. If they applied it, we don't know if they applied it. We can make an educated guess that they did. But they also had 2 other training instructions. We don't have hippiatric tracts, which are texts for curing horses from diseases. They are documented in other areas in the ancient Near East. In Ugarit, for example, we don't know anything about acclimatization. And the Kikkuli text is not a training program to prepare the horses for tactical chariot training with the individual chariot units. And we don't know if the Kikkuli text was composed in the context of the Hittite Kingdom chariot, but it certainly seems that it enabled the horses to develop stamina to pull horses that carries 3 men. And Steve has done some research on that and can talk about that. We're coming now towards the end about some of the terms. You already saw Dana and the difficulties of translating it. Now, in our case, the Dana is kind of solved based on research of Theo and Greg Melchett, where the distance, where the assumption of 1 Dana equals 10.1 kilometers is simply outdated. And you see that still in Kammenhuber in the old research. So we need to come up with, we need to use 1.5 kilometers for 1 Dana. And certainly Stark's reconstruction is too short. For eco, it's a subunit. You can see the same thing. This goes into probably too much detail. The Dana is the Sumerian equivalent. Eco is an arcadogram, is written in italics here rendered for us. And so we have 115 meters. And then the third training unit, training instruction uses a Hittite word, which is Gipesha. And Nyland wrote about terms penna and pike, and these are very important terms for motion that are attested or used by Kikkuli throughout the text. And on the left side, you see Nyland's article in Journal of Near Eastern Studies. And on the middle and the right side, you see the Chicago Hittite Dictionary entry for penna and for pike. It's just to visualize it for you here. in this round. And what it means, penna is usually indicating something to drive, say cattle, and page is usually meaning to chase. And you can see that to chase, pursue, hunt, but also in when you take in the Kikkuli text, here it has been used gallop to translate gallop for page. And this is the last slide we have, and we leave it here with Hans Gustav Güterbock, the famous Hittitologist here in Chicago. Sorry for the double off there. He wrote in his review, rather harsh review of Kammerhuber in JAOS 1964, that she didn't really look into the different options. Does penna mean walk and page means trot? Or does penna mean walk and page means gallop? Or is it trot and gallop? Sorry, walk there. Or is it walk and page as fast as speed, regardless whether to trot or gallop? Or is it walk and trot and it's gallop? So we leave it at this here. We thank you for your patience. It was quite long, but I leave this slide on. And
can we, for one moment, go back to the slide where you have the Hittite of the beginning and the Kammerhuber translation on the other side? It's way...
Yeah. It's at the beginning, right?
It's pretty much at the beginning. Yeah, here. So, I mean, just to what we haven't done yet, I think, is give you simply one example of what the text looks like. So you see here the Hittite text on the left, all lowercase italics is Hittite. The straight capitals are the Sumerian signs, and there are some where you see, for example, at the beginning of line 6, the italicized capitals, that's Akkadian, and those are just scribal conventions. But so it reads when he, and it's not indicated who, when he, somebody, let's say the groom or the trainer, lets the horses out onto the pasture, he harnesses them, and here you have the verb penna, he trots, gallops, walks them for 3 miles, while galloping, or that's the other word, them for 7 equal measures of length. He parks them back for 10 of these measures, and then he releases them, probably meaning unharnesses, unhitches them. He takes care of them, grooms them maybe. They are watered. Then he brings them into the stable. And he gives them 1 handful of a certain kind of cereal, 2 handfuls of barley probably, and 1 handful of hay mixed in. And they eat that up completely. And when they finish their ration, their fodder, he tethers them, literally translated, he tethers them up to the peg. So that's, and then that goes on, paragraph after paragraph. So it's, you could say it's a pretty boring text, but it is full of detailed information about what they do with these horses. And I think what we need is input of real horse specialists for us to kind of fill in some of these terms, to see what is, to tell us what is realistic, what is not realistic, what about the fodder. Nyland has done a lot of that work, but I think we need more. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I feel very much, hang on, I'm just going to put my try and put my note, doesn't want to, there we go. Thank you. Yes, we've had some very interesting comments too from, so I'm sure we're going to have a lively debate now from, had comments from Stephen and from Anastasia and various others. Anastasia's comment was how similar this is to Jordanus Rufus so many years later. There's a similar kind of approach. He introduces himself, he says, I am a horse trainer. It's an identity that people can relate to. So I certainly have some questions, but I'm going to ask if anyone else has. I'm sure you will have questions. And just to say thank you once again to our speakers, Theo and Peter, for such a fantastic overview of the text itself, and also for me just as valuable the work that's been done on it now in the past 2 centuries, really. Yes. Fine. So does anyone have any questions?
I have one. I have several, but I have a list.
Me too.
Yeah, this is more because we looked at I looked at depictions in Egypt, and I was wondering what type of horses they use in front of their chariot. And of course, the king is always depicted with stallions. However, it's not very practical. You also can't use mares in certain time periods if you do use stallions because of the hormones. So you eliminate basically half your stock. So my suspicion is that they also gelded their horses and also used mares as well as geldings in front of the chariots. So my question was if you have any idea what type of horses they used in front of the Hittite chariots, and if there is perhaps a word for gelding in Hittite, because there isn't in Egyptian.
I think that's more a question for Peter, but about the gelding, no. To my knowledge, we don't have a word in Hittite for gelding. So, but for the rest, I will leave to Peter.
Yeah, I would. I think Steve can also answer that. So the Kikkuli text does not, as I will add that point. Thanks for bringing this up. We don't know, when I mentioned that we don't know what horses they choose. We only have to rely on what we see. Maybe the representations which usually show male horses. So there's no information on this in the Kikkuli text. Steve, you have any?
Is there anything in the book?
Yeah, there's a lot of dispute about this. My impression is that from people I've talked to in the field, is that most of the horses, male horses, were gelded.
Right.
But there is a fascinating account of Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt,
Yeah.
getting ready for battle with the 2 chariot forces were drawn up, Egyptian and I believe it was a Canaanite chariot force from Kadesh. And the Canaanite forces released a mare in season
Yeah.
to run along the battle line to discomfit the Egyptian male chariot horses.
Yeah.
Obviously, this didn't work because Thutmose won the battle handily. And in discussing this with other people, historians of Bronze Age warfare, this almost seems an apocryphal story, but it probably isn't. But if they were geldings, they would have been discomfited by a mare in season, but they would have also been controlled by their chariot drivers.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, these were highly trained horses. After
Yeah.
they got through the Kikkuli program and then the postgraduate program, which is what I call it, of schooling in how to pull a chariot with another horse, very complicated and very demanding. That's going to medical school, like the
Exactly.
equivalent.
Yeah. That in that Egyptian tomb tells more about the tomb owner's wish to show how brave he was than about the fact account. Of course, and it also shows that the Egyptians knew very well how stallions responded to mares. So
even gelded stallions, but
yeah. So
but
Yeah.
but they were also highly trained. And so I don't think,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that was a desperate measure by the Canaanites.
It's
So,
still a tricky question. So, but we also
yeah,
have a word for castration or castration we might have, but not for gelding. So
yeah, yeah.
There's a similar story from the crusading period. I forget which side did it to whom, but where a mare was released to distract the stallions. Just trying to think where I read that. Might have been in Runciman's book. I'd need to check, but a similar story. So either it was a familiar tactic through time, possibly, or as you say, perhaps just apocryphal that's got passed down the ages.
Who
Because a
knows?
lot
Yeah,
of those stories have, yeah,
yeah.
both.
yes. Yeah. So more questions from the room. Sure, there must be some.
In the chat.
No, the hand.
Oh, there's a hand. Yeah, Hilke.
There's a hand. Hilke, yes.
How
Fire
did
away.
you do
Yeah,
that?
that's me. I thought being polite, raise my hand. Yeah, I was wondering if you can tell us something about the intended readership, because from the translation, it seems that it's sort of like a report of what he's doing, or is it meant as an instruction? Who is the intended reader here?
It is. I don't think there is any past tense in the text, so it is meant as an instruction. He does this, he does that. There are no women in the text, so it's an instruction. Yeah, and the readership is. I would say the intended readership, since it has the character of instruction, has to be people who would want to condition their horses, who would want to put their own horses through the same program. And I think it's detailed enough, as Anne Nyland has also shown, that you can do it, you can follow the program, you can put it to practice. But again, this goes back to the question of, yeah, as I said, it was only available in a single copy on the Acropolis, not the place where they would keep tablets that were of daily importance. So that's very difficult, but it is an instruction.
And is there any sort of indication to who had horses, who had access?
Everybody
Or
with
is it,
chariots.
No, no.
is that only the elite, or is it also like wider
I
spread?
mean, we have a Hittite law code, just like you know the law code of Hammurabi, for example. And in that law code, towards the end, there is also what people often call a tariff list. Tariffs are very popular nowadays. A tariff list that sets prices. And horses and equids in general, mules, donkeys, and so forth, clearly belong to the most expensive items in that tariff list. My impression would be that horses were, not everybody could afford horses or mules. They were expensive. One other interesting indication that we have is we have very many what we call ritual texts, therapeutic healing rituals in Hittite. And sometimes part of that is that an offering has to be made to a deity to solve a certain problem, for to be healed, to heal a patient. And in one case, the prescription, so to speak, is, okay, bring a mule and that will be slaughtered to the god. But then there's a following line that says, if somebody can't afford a mule, they can bring a clay or wood substitute. So a little effigy or image. So that all points or suggests that not everybody would be able to afford equids in general.
But to that, I would add that the armed forces of late Bronze Age kingdoms were chariotry heavy. So presumably the state would provide the horses or cover the cost of it.
Sure.
It's like a defense spending. And it's important to grasp that these chariot forces that took to the field were vast in the number of horses they had. For example, 500 chariots, which each Egyptian battle group had at the Battle of Kadesh, and there were 5 battle groups, would have had 2 horses for each chariot, but also 5 spares. So we're talking when a chariot army went to battle on the road, on the march, it had a remuda of about 10,000 horses, in addition to the 2 designated for each chariot. That's something that people need to understand. These were huge armies in terms of the number of horses they had. And
that's true, but that is all at the state's expense.
Yes, exactly. I agree totally with what you're saying about individual ownership. Yeah. But there were lots of horses, and that's why I think Kikkuli's program was in the nature of an industrial program. Like each semester of 214 or 184 days, you would have seen a class of several hundred horses training at the same time in the Kikkuli method, and there would have been an area outside of Hattusa where it would have been like a factory, like grooms, hundreds of grooms, the managers. It's really awesome to think of. And yes, I will be writing about this. So
sorry. I was just going to say, it certainly sounds like it's so well structured and so very specific that it sounds as though this is serious training for something like warfare. You're conditioning the horses through a program. This is how it appears. It appears like it's conditioning specifically for warfare to me, rather than just...
and I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's all really I was wanted to say. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
About the tariffs, like, are they taxed based on ownership of the animals or on the license to graze them?
I don't think we know.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I know Rich Beale said that with the Hittites, providing horses was a feudal duty of the various kingdoms under the Hittite aegis. That would have been different in Egypt, though, because Egypt was a centralized state. So it's hard to say how that tariff would have been assessed.
There are Ramside period tariffs, aren't there, which include horses? I'm pretty sure.
I'm not
need
sure.
to check that, but I think so. Yeah.
We have the price for donkeys, not for horses.
I think there are for horses too. I think I'm trying to think who would have done work on that. Jack Jansen, and would probably have. I seem to remember he did something on Ramside period prices and chariots. Anyway, yeah.
I was wondering if we know anything about where these 10,000s of horses were kept, because I'm a little bit skeptical, because unless you are at war, you don't need so many. So I'm also wondering...
Yeah, you do.
Extent... No, I mean, I'm also wondering to what extent they were actually state-owned, or to what extent they were called to action, and the people who privately owned horses were sort of half enlisted, like drafted for the army and asked to bring their horses. Or a combination. Kate Kanna has recently published in 2 different articles that you really don't need so many horses if you're not at war. So
yeah, do the administrative texts, like other texts, indicate a logistical trail of the logistics that it entails to even have 100 horses, let alone 1,000? Because they are talking about barley and stuff.
n-
You would
no, I would have to go back to the texts, but I don't think. Personally, I think Steve's numbers may be a bit on the high side. I mean, I'm sure that for a major military confrontation like the Battle at Kadesh, where I think it is reported that the Hittite troops were counted about 48,000 or so, there were probably thousands of horses, but they came with all the allies and so forth, so from different parts of Anatolia. And then again, I can only emphasize that it is very uncertain to what extent the Kikkuli text as we have it, in spite of all its specifics, was really put to annual practice. We simply don't know. There is no evidence for it. There is one building in the capital of Hattusa that now has been identified as a possible or having a possible stable structure. It's very small, maybe 10, 20 horses fitted in there. So I mean, it's all very uncertain and difficult to prove.
So more
I
like
can say this: the Assyrians in the Neo-Assyrian period kept detailed military records, and they do provide numbers. They would say like up to 10,000 horses for a chariot force of 500 chariots. So,
Yes.
I mean, we're talking a lot. I'm assuming that they would be dispersed among the various nobles who were expected to provide horses for their feudal duties. And then there would come a muster, a national muster for war, where they would bring the horses in. Obviously, they wouldn't have 10,000 horses in one place all the time, but they would have.
Really long
I'm sorry.
to get there and to train them. So it's a multiple year program. So unless you are always training for war, you have a problem when conflict breaks out.
I think you're always training for war in the Bronze Age.
Right.
I think that's a feature of that's a characteristic of Bronze Age civilization in the Near East.
Men will be men.
I mean, you would only would have one major battle with horses, and there would be quite a wastage rate, because when you think how fragile horses' legs are,
exactly.
I don't know whether they would be shod, whether they would have any kind of I don't know, strapping under their hooves to protect their hooves. But a lot of horses would fall by the wayside because they would get sore feet. And that would be they wouldn't be able to gallop with sore feet. So, you've lost your horse then. So they would just have to have so many in reserve for one battle.
You're right. Quite correct. Yeah, I agree. A good analog for that is to look at modern, say, an armored division on a route march.
Yeah.
They're always breaking down. Tanks are breaking down constantly. An armored division never goes into battle at full strength. And I think when I write about chariot combat and chariotry forces, I like to think in terms that the horse was a mechanism. It required fuel, it required maintenance, it required all the things that a highly complex machine requires. And by the same token, they break down a lot. If they're under stress. You can't assume that all the horses you started out with pulling chariots would finish up the campaign. So I agree with you, Elizabeth. Yeah. Totally.
The other thing you said, Stephen, which I also agreed with, was that you said that Kikkuli seemed to have a very humane training program.
Yes.
And I've been doing some work. I'm trying to write a lecture at the moment on horse riding in history. And it seems to me that the people that have stood out with horses throughout the centuries are people who've somehow understood the psychology of horses and how you can get the best out of them.
Totally.
I'm talking about people like Xenophon from the Greeks.
Yes,
He was
yes.
a major standout trainer. I mean, coming more recent, I mean, and his work is still used by the Spanish riding school today in their training.
Yeah.
People like de la Grenière, who was a Frenchman in the 1700s, who again, he worked out, he was very, very good at working out how to train horses, how to supple them. And these are the people who sort of through the years have really made their mark with horses. And I suspect Kikkuli was a bit like that too.
Well, it's interesting. I've read several translations of the Kikkuli text. I've studied it very closely. And what came out from doing that is how assiduous he is in the care. Like he describes what he feeds them, and modern scientists in equine physiology have analyzed his diet for horses, and they see that it's, horses are prone to stomach ailments.
Yeah.
And if you don't feed them correctly, he had a mash that was specifically designed for that. Everything he did, he gave them rest. He stipulated that at the end of a training day, they would be rubbed down with oil or butter or some sort of form. He took them bathing. He stipulated that in the stable they had to be kept warm. There's just the subtext to it all is that he understood what he was dealing with, and he wanted these horses to be well cared for, and this was all also practical. They had to be psychologically prepared for chariot combat, and that's very stressful. And they had to be made brave, like confident and confident in the people dealing with it.
Yeah.
So you couldn't treat them like badly. They had to be treated well.
Did the text say anything about desensitization training?
You mean to combat?
Anything to desensitize?
No, yeah. I'm not familiar with that.
That we have in Egypt, at least in relief.
Yeah. I'm sure they would have been subjected to loud noises, stresses, things like that, but nothing cruel. Like the idea is to build their confidence. And in the first 2 years of a horse's life, which is about when Kikkuli would get them, they're still developing their neural patterns. And so the Kikkuli method was ideal not only for conditioning the horse physically, but it also conditioned the psychological well-being of the horse through the development of these neural patterns. And I'm not sure if I'm using the correct terms here. I would need to check my notes. But the point is that they needed to be made confident, in what they did, and that requires a horse that it feels good about itself, if you will.
I mean, another thing, very, very basic, when you're talking about chariots, and you've got two horses together, they've got to get on as well. You can't have horses.
Yeah, they have to be taught to get on.
Yeah. You can't have horses that are going to have a go at each other, or.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There's a great scene in the movie Ben-Hur, the original one, where Ben-Hur's being introduced to the 4 horses he will be using in the chariot race in the arena. And the owner of the horses is talking about the characteristics, the personality of each horse. He's saying one is slow but steady, one is wild but fast. Like he was distinguishing between the temperaments and pairing them and building on each one's strength to cover up the weaknesses. So I think what you want to see in a chariot horse is really described well in the book of Job in the Bible, that famous passage where God, speaking from the whirlwind, tells Job, "Have you given the horses thunder? He goeth forth to battle. He paweth in the valley. He rejoiceth in his strength. He saith, ha, ha, to the captain shouting." That's a horse trained for battle. And I think that tells us. It's a really stunning passage. And it tells us a lot about what they wanted in a chariot horse.
I agree. I'm going to go to Hilke in a minute, who has another question. I just want to say, Elizabeth, you mentioned feet covering for the feet, some kind of shoeing, something like that. Not as far as we're aware. There's nothing
Right.
in documentary or other sources that would suggest that but there are Egyptian texts where they talk about the horses traveling through the mountains, and they talk about them going one behind the other, as if it's on a narrow mountain path. So I mean, obviously, one of the things I think they would certainly been selecting for would have been horses with really good feet.
Yeah.
I think that would have been extremely important in those conditions. And Hilke, do you want to come in
Yeah,
there?
I had another question about like the text and the text as a tradition, because I think it was Anastasia who noticed that a lot of the later texts are similar in format, in the way they start and sort of how they're structured and everything. So I don't know if you can say anything like what would have been the first sort of copied Kikkuli text, like in another culture or another language.
I'm not sure.
Peter?
Yeah, could you rephrase that? I'm not sure I understood.
Yeah.
Well, so I work with Arabic texts from the 9th century, and they are almost word for word the same of older texts. So, and then we also see that a lot of the fragments that I work with come up in like later Italian and Spanish language texts, which are also like really, really similar. So we have, yeah, sort of come up with this idea that if Kikkuli is the first one, then he's probably part of his text is sort of like a format that it gets copied over time. As other cultures sort of adopt the horse, they adopt the knowledge that goes with it. So I was wondering if there has been any effort to find out sort of how Kikkuli's format ended up sort of in like what Anastasia said, for example, what is it, 13th century Europe?
Jordanus Rufus, yes.
Yeah, so how does this sort of transmission road go?
Well, I don't think precursors from the ancient Middle East have been identified. It's really the first such text that we know of. And as far as the Hittite Kingdom goes, it's also the last one. I mean, there are no other horse training or even hippological texts in general from the Hittite Kingdom. And I also don't know them for the Anatolian Iron Age, so the first millennium. So it's a pretty unique ensemble, but I don't know whether that answers your question.
Well, we do have a Middle Assyrian text, training text from Assur,
okay, but that's
which is from a different area. So we know that there were training texts composed, but there is no tradition that you see for your Arabic texts or other texts later. So
the other thing, though, is that even if you're talking about the very first Kikkuli text iteration, this is a fully formed program. So that indicates what they were doing had been around for quite a while. It wasn't invented by Kikkuli for his service with the Hittites. It's a very complex and sophisticated program, right down to giving them menus for their diets and what they do during the whole course of the day. Every hour of the day is covered. So there must have been a lot before this, and for a very long time.
That's certainly true. I mean, it's a fully developed program, it seems.
Yeah.
Also, to me, I'm not at all a horse expert. So it may be a scribal fixation of a tradition that was developed in Mitanni, so northern Mesopotamia, for who knows how long. And that also means that Kikkuli was there ever a person Kikkuli? Think of Homer. We still don't know. Was there ever a actual person named Homer? or is that just a label that we have attached to it, to the Iliad and Odyssey? So, and the same goes for Kikkuli. Was he once a real person? And if he was, when? I mean, his personality may also go back, who knows how long.
Golly, I
Yeah,
want to
so
believe it was.
so I
Yeah, that's a
recognize
very,
also
very good point.
I
Sorry,
recognize like
Lonica.
Anastasia is saying, like he is introducing himself. I recognize it from the early medieval Arabic text, where these knowledge preservation texts basically are commissioned by royalty or aristocracy, and then it's important that the guy sort of introduces himself so that everybody knows, yeah, he's the specialist. So that's why I was also wondering, like, who's the intended reader, and maybe it's a commissioned text actually, because yeah, it's very established kind of knowledge. Thank you.
Theo,
Yeah.
could I ask you or Peter? I've seen translations of that first line saying he's Kikkuli, master of horses. Is that legitimate, or is that just a romantic interpretation?
No,
The letter.
there's no I. It is purely third person.
Oh, right. That's what I meant. Thus speaks Kikkuli, master of horses. I just wondered if master of horses is a legitimate
Yeah,
translation.
it wouldn't go there. From the etymological point, you don't have the word for master in there. You would, I mean, the fact that you can't analyze the middle part, what was rendered as Shah, the SSA, it doesn't mean that it cannot be master, but I would say rather not. I think horse master is more like a modern term. That's why we didn't use it. So horse trainer gives us a little bit more, but it's not 100% one-to-one translation in this respect. But we wouldn't go with horse master or horse master.
Okay.
Wouldn't go for.
That's a very good point too, because master of the horse, certainly in England, only came into use fairly late on, post-medieval, and before that it was marshal, which gives it, or marshal, which gives it a direct link to actually horse care. It's about understanding the horses, knowing how to look after them, rather than the idea of somebody being sort of a master, a royal role or something of that important. It's right into the heart of horse care there with Marshall. Lonica, you have a question?
Yeah, I have one more, a language one. You mentioned 3 different words for wheeled vehicles, which is super cool because in Egyptian there are 3 words that we translate as chariot. I'm just not convinced that they're all the same chariots. So I was wondering if you could tell me which one of those words came with the horse and which ones were already in existence, if there's anything on that.
No. Well, so I would be happy to share with you the article that I wrote on wheeled vehicles in the what we call the Real Lexicon de Assyriologie, so it's sort of an encyclopedia. So where I think you will find together all the relevant information. Yeah, so if you send me an email or so that I have your email address, I could send you a PDF of that article, and
Which
maybe
is the one on the slide. This is your work.
right. Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry that I'm not able to answer that off the top of my head.
That's okay. I can imagine there would have been a word that came with the animal, but also there's clearly a difference, ceremonial wagon, chariot, and a four-wheeler. So it's interesting that there are so many different ones. And were all of them pulled by horses?
Well, iconographically, we see also wheeled vehicles pulled by oxen, although that is mostly in a divine setting. For example, the top male god is the storm god, as we always translate him. And the storm god is always symbolized by a bull. And so whenever the storm god is depicted as standing on a chariot, his chariot is pulled by bulls. And I would have to refer to the specialists on wheeled vehicles here. And again, I'm not at all a specialist in that respect. How often were wheeled vehicles pulled by oxen?
In the Medinat Habu reliefs of the Sea Peoples, Ramses III's battle with the Sea Peoples at the gates of Egypt, the Sea Peoples have their families packed aboard two-wheeled carts pulled by oxen.
Okay.
Not horses. So that's
So
interesting.
Neo-Assyrian reliefs have that for Elamic people. They flee on carts as well. Then, but there's a different problem. The convention of
Yeah.
depicting horses and these what's called onagers and those things. But yeah, we don't know what the texts don't really. They say it and then we know, or they don't say it. It's usually Gish Giga, which you see there, bullet point number 2, is assumed being drawn by 2 horses.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And the other ones we don't know.
Well, the early war wagons used by the Sumerians were pulled by asses.
Right.
But that was before horses were appearing in the area. So obviously horses were a better choice, even though asses and mules are in some ways more resilient than horses, but they're also very difficult to train for battle. And with you have to go through a complex breeding program.
Yeah, they're infertile.
It's much harder to breed them on a mass scale than horses. So, but there were asses used by the Sumerians, definitely,
I think it was on
hybrids as well. It was hybrids.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Hybrids, like mules.
Yeah. We have those terms. You remember the Anshe part there? I'm not sure if I find it here.
Yeah.
Chikula, and there is, you have Anshe plus something else, and we have actually more components after Anshe than we can think of hybrids.
Yeah, hybrids would have been better for pulling those Sumerian. I think they were probably hybrids, but what kind they were, we don't know.
Joris Sarens deals with this in his dissertation, which is already 50 years old, despite the new edition. Whoever's interested, there's an article also in the Real Lexicon about that. You see there on the screen, it's page 482. There's another one that deals with not Anatolia, but with Mesopotamia. And there we go into these different Anshe plus something and what it means.
Thanks. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. I don't know how we're doing for time, Anastasia, whether we are likely to be thrown out soon. It's so interesting. I reckon we could probably sit here all evening. But I know that Peter and Theo have prepared some literature for us, which will be made available, which is lovely.
I will send you
Sorry?
slides. I will send you the slides of the bibliography at the end, which we didn't show here, by tomorrow, the weekend or something, and then you can upload the slides, and then you can everybody who wants can download the slides.
And
That's great, and that means we can ask any questions that we have. Yeah.
Yes. Contact information, and then just one hint, legal hint: we don't own the copyrights to these images that we've shown. So if you want to publish those, you need to obtain your own copyrights. This is just for educational and personal purposes. We just have to say we're just dealing with illustrations for another publication, and we just have to say it. So
right. That's excellent. Thank you. So I'm sure everyone understands the complexities of using illustrations. I think we've all been there, and just to make sure that you always have the appropriate authorities.
You could send an email out. You could send an email to everybody when you receive the slides. So,
yes, gladly. Let me just type, for those of you who don't have it, my email address.
Let me.
Sorry,
I think I'll stop recording here, Miriam, because if you are not discussing, I'll stop recording here.